The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of relentless, soul-soaking downpour that turns the world to gray noise. It was early spring, and the air smelled of ozone and wet earth. I was out back, my boots sinking into the mud, trying to secure the first pontoon for the jetty I'd been planning for months. My own little slice of peace on the water. This little house by the reservoir was supposed to be my retirement, a place to finally put down the tools and quiet the noise in my head. This happened to me, and if you're watching Karenology, you probably know. It's never just a misunderstanding. It's never just about the rules. That's when the headlights cut through the gloom. A big black SUV, the kind that cost more than my first house, had pulled right onto my lawn, its tires chewing up the new grass. The engine hummed with a quiet menace. For a second, I was just frozen, blinded. Then the driver's side door opened and a figure emerged under a massive golf-sized umbrella. Karen Miller, head of our homeowners association. She wasn't alone. A second figure got out from the passenger side. A big guy built like a refrigerator, wearing a jacket with a small, discreet logo for a private security firm. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't seem to care about the rain. His eyes were fixed on me. Karen crunched across the gravel I'd laid down, her expensive shoes somehow staying pristine. She stopped just out of the mud, her face a mask of polite concern that didn't reach her eyes. You know the type. All teeth, no warmth. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice cutting through the sound of the rain. "There seems to be a problem." I wiped the rain from my face. "No problem here, Karen. Just a little wet." Her smile tightened. "Your construction. We have received a complaint that it threatens our community's infrastructure. The homeowners association has to ask you to stop. Immediately." I laughed, a short, bitter sound. "What infrastructure? It's a floating dock. I have the permit right here from the Army Corps of Engineers, stamped and approved." I patted the pocket of my work coat, where the folded papers were safe in a plastic bag. She didn't even glance at it. "That's a federal permit, Mr. Chen. It governs navigation. It does not supersede our community bylaws, which govern the safety of our shared utilities." She said the words, "our community," like she owned every blade of grass in it. The security guard took a slow, deliberate step forward. His hand was resting near his hip, just a casual posture that was anything but. I felt a familiar cold knot tighten in my gut. My hand went into my other pocket, my fingers closing around the cool, heavy steel of my father's old dynamometer. It was a precision instrument for measuring force, a relic from a time when engineering was about building things that lasted. Right then, it was just an anchor, a piece of my old man, a piece of the man I used to be. "Lady told you to leave," the security guard grunted. It wasn't a suggestion. I looked past them, toward the houses ringing the reservoir. Lights were flicking on, silhouettes in the windows. My neighbors were watching. They were watching me get pushed around on my own property. Have you ever felt that? That hot flush of public humiliation, the feeling of being made small in front of the world? If you've been in a situation like this, you know what I'm talking about. And if you do, maybe hit that like button. It helps to know you're not alone. I wasn't going to win a fight with the refrigerator. I slowly raised my hands, a gesture of surrender. "Fine," I said, the word tasting like rust. "For now." The next day I walked into the HOA meeting, feeling like I was walking into an ambush. The room was the community clubhouse, a stuffy space that smelled of old coffee and quiet resentment. I had my folder, my permit, my confidence. I was an engineer. I dealt in facts, in physics. I was ready for a logical discussion. I should have known better. Karen was already at the head of the long table, flanked by the other two board members who just nodded along to whatever she said. She let me make my case, her expression patient, almost motherly. Then, when I was done, she gave a little sigh. "Thank you, Michael," she said, using my full name like a teacher scolding a child. "We appreciate your passion. However, you seem to have missed a crucial document in your research." She nodded to her husband, who was operating a clunky old projector. An image flashed onto the screen. It was an old, yellowed zoning map of the development, dated 1973. A faint red line snaked along the shoreline, running right through my property. The line was labeled Utility Easement. Karen stood up, using a laser pointer to trace the line. "This, Mr. Chen, is the original drainage collector easement. It's a designated channel, a ghost lane, if you will. No permanent or semi-permanent structures are allowed within 50 feet of it. Your proposed jetty lies directly on top of it." The room was silent. I stared at the map, my mind racing. I'd pulled every current plan, every digital record from the county. This map wasn't in any of them. "This is 50 years old," I said, my voice tight. "It's not on any current public record." "Some things don't need to be," she replied smoothly. "It's part of the original covenants of this community, a foundational document. It protects us all." She looked around the room, meeting the eyes of my neighbors. "It protects us from floods, from system failures. It protects our property values." The projector hummed, casting that faded red line across the screen, a scar from 50 years ago. But all I could feel was the weight of my neighbors' eyes. They weren't just looking at a man who'd lost an argument. They were looking at the fool Karen Miller had just created, and her smile told me the show was just getting started. Her smile hung in the air long after the projector was turned off. I walked out of that clubhouse feeling like I'd just been professionally disassembled in front of a live audience. The whispers followed me out the door. It wasn't just about a jetty anymore. In 15 minutes, Karen had turned me from a new neighbor into a public liability, an arrogant outsider who didn't care about their safety. My own neighbors, people I'd waved to just that morning, now looked at me with suspicion. The worst part? She'd used my own field, engineering, as the weapon. I knew that old map was a smokescreen, but I needed to prove it. And for that, I needed someone who knew this place inside and out. Someone who'd been here longer than the ink on those new bylaws had been dry. I needed Bob. Bob was a retired civil engineer who lived 3 houses down. A good man, I thought. We'd spent a few afternoons talking shop, leaning against his fence, complaining about modern building codes. He knew the history of this development. He had to know something about a 50-foot utility easement that apparently nobody had heard of for half a century. His workshop was usually a hive of activity, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and welding flux. But when I knocked on the open garage door, it was silent. The tools were all hung neatly on the pegboard, clean and cold. Bob was sitting on a stool, just staring at a half-finished birdhouse. He looked up, and the usual friendly spark in his eyes wasn't there. "Mike," he said, his voice flat. "Bob, you got a minute? I need to ask you about that meeting." I stepped inside, the chill of the concrete floor seeping through my boots. "This drainage collector from the 70s. You've been here since the beginning. You ever heard of it?" He didn't meet my eye. He picked up a piece of sandpaper and ran it over the smooth edge of the birdhouse, a useless gesture. I heard about the meeting. "So, is it real, this easement?" He set the sandpaper down, a long silent stretch between us, filled only by the distant hum of a lawnmower. "Mike," he said finally, his voice low, "let it go." I felt a jolt, like I'd touched a live wire. "Let it go? Bob, she's fabricating a legal barrier on my property. This is my home." "It's not worth the fight," he said, still looking at the birdhouse. "Karen, she's just trying to protect the community. You don't understand the whole situation." That phrase again? The whole situation. What situation? I felt the ground shift under my feet. This wasn't the friendly old-timer I knew. This was a man with a secret, a man who was scared. Have you ever put your trust in someone, only to have them look you in the eye and shut the door in your face? It's a special kind of cold. "Whose side are you on, Bob?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were full of a tired, deep-set fear. "I'm on the side of peace and quiet, Mike. You should be too." I walked away from his silent workshop with a new, heavier weight in my gut. It wasn't just me against Karen anymore. The lines were being drawn, and I was on the wrong side of them. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. A notification from the neighborhood community page. It was a post from Karen. It didn't mention my name. It didn't have to. It was a beautifully crafted piece of propaganda about outside interests attempting to circumvent long-standing safety protocols, and how the homeowners association was working tirelessly to protect their shared assets and way of life. The comments underneath were a cascade of praise. "Thank you for looking out for us, Karen. So glad the board is on top of this." I was officially the villain in my own story. Then came the second punch. An email pinged in my inbox. The subject line read, "Important update to your homeowner's insurance policy." It was from Miller Insurance, Karen's agency. My premium, it informed me in cold corporate language, was increasing by 20%. The reason cited: recalibration of risk due to proximity to critical community infrastructure and proposed construction activities. It was a direct hit. She wasn't just blocking me, she was bleeding me, using her professional power as a weapon. Every month, a piece of my retirement savings would go straight into her pocket, a little tax for daring to defy her. I sank into my chair, the email glowing on the screen. The memory of the bridge incident washed over me. The flawed steel, the cracked support, the lead engineer, my partner, swearing the calculations were solid. I took the fall for him, for the team. I chose peace and quiet then, too. It cost me my career. I stared out the window, through the rain-streaked glass. In the distance, rising over the trees, was the hulking gray silhouette of the old reservoir dam. It had been there for 80 years, a silent concrete giant. And as I looked at it, Bob's scared eyes and Karen's obsession with infrastructure suddenly clicked together into a terrifying thought. The fight wasn't about my little jetty. It never was. The problem was much, much bigger. The thought of the dam latched onto my mind and wouldn't let go. An 80-year-old concrete structure holding back millions of gallons of water. If there was a real infrastructure problem, a secret big enough to make a good man like Bob terrified, it wasn't some phantom pipe under my lawn. It was that dam. And Karen Miller was using my jetty as a smokescreen to keep people from looking in the right direction. I knew I couldn't fight her on her turf. The community bylaws were her kingdom, the neighbors her subjects. I needed to bring the fight back to mine, the world of facts, data, and hard science. If there was no drainage collector under my property, I would prove it. No more arguing over yellowed 50-year-old maps. I was going to show them the truth of the ground beneath their feet. I spent $4,000, a painful chunk of my savings, to hire a geotechnical firm. They came out with a ground-penetrating radar unit, a sophisticated piece of equipment that looks like a futuristic lawnmower. For a whole afternoon, a young technician pushed it back and forth across my property in a precise grid, his eyes glued to a small screen. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and the faint electric hum of the machine. The report came back 2 days later. It was beautiful. Page after page of clean, clear data showing nothing but soil, rock, and tree roots down to a depth of 20 feet. No pipes, no voids, no collector. It was a $4,000 piece of paper that said Karen Miller was a liar. I felt a surge of triumph. This was it. The silver bullet. The kind of hard, undeniable evidence that would shatter her narrative and expose her for the fraud she was. I requested another emergency board meeting, feeling the tide was about to turn. This time, the clubhouse was packed. Word had gotten out that I was coming back with proof. The air was thick with anticipation. I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me, a mixture of curiosity and hostility. Karen was at the head of the table, looking as serene as ever. She let me set up my laptop and connect it to the projector. I didn't waste time with speeches. I put the final page of the Joradar report on the screen, a 3D map of my property, color-coded to show solid ground. As you can see, I said, my voice ringing with a confidence I hadn't felt in weeks. There is no drainage collector. There is no infrastructure. The ground beneath my property is solid, undisturbed earth. The 1973 map is either irrelevant or a complete fabrication. I let the image sink in. I heard a few murmurs ripple through the crowd. I saw a flicker of doubt on a few faces. For a second, I thought I'd won. Then Karen stood up. She wasn't smiling anymore. She looked grave, concerned. "You are absolutely right, Mr. Chen," she said, her voice dripping with practiced sincerity. The room went silent. I stared at her, completely thrown. What was this? "Of course the original clay pipe collector isn't there," she continued, turning to address the crowd. "It was decommissioned and replaced in 1992 with a much deeper, more modern system. We are all grateful for that upgrade." She paused, letting her words hang in the air. "What you fail to understand, what your expensive report doesn't show, is that the old empty channel was left in place. It now serves a new, even more critical function." She clicked a button on her remote. My Georadar scan vanished, replaced by a complex diagram of the reservoir and the dam. The old channel acts as an emergency spillway overflow. In the event of a catastrophic failure or a 100-year flood, it's designed to divert pressure away from the base of the dam, preventing a total collapse. It was brilliant. It was also a complete lie, but it sounded terrifyingly plausible. She was weaving a new story, a bigger, scarier one. "Your deep-set pilings for this jetty," she went on, her voice rising with manufactured urgency, "would puncture and compromise this critical safety feature. You are not just building a dock, Mr. Chen. You are threatening to weaken the one thing that protects this entire community from being washed away." She pointed the laser at the diagram, then moved the red dot to my property. "Right here." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. She had done it again. She had taken my facts, my expensive hard-won proof, and twisted it into a weapon against me. I was no longer just a rule breaker. Now, I was the man who was single-handedly trying to drown them all in their sleep. I looked around the room. The doubt was gone from their faces, replaced by cold, hard fear. And that fear was pointed directly at me. I opened my mouth to argue, to tell them it was nonsense, that the hydrology didn't work that way, but the words died in my throat. I saw Karen's eyes, and in them, a flash of pure, predatory triumph. She had beaten me. She had checkmated me. What do you do when the truth doesn't matter? When the person with the scariest story wins, no matter how big the lie? As I stood there, speechless and defeated, I noticed something. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail. As she talked about the dam, about the catastrophic failure, her hand went to her neck, and her fingers nervously twisted the simple gold ring on the chain she always wore. It was a nervous tick, a tell. She was lying, and she was scared. Not of me, she was terrified of the dam itself. The image of Karen twisting that ring, her eyes filled with a flicker of genuine fear, stayed with me. It was the crack in her perfect facade. She wasn't a master strategist protecting her community. She was a woman trying to keep a lid on a secret she couldn't control, and that secret was the dam. I was done playing her game. No more public meetings, no more $4,000 reports that she could twist into weapons. The truth wasn't in the clubhouse, and it wasn't in the county records office. It was out there, in 80-year-old concrete and rain-swollen water. That night, the storm that had been threatening for days finally broke. Rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled like a hungry animal. It was the perfect cover. Around 2 in the morning, when the last lights in the neighborhood had gone out, I pulled on my old climbing gear. It had been years since I'd used it for anything more than cleaning gutters, but the motions came back like a second language. The familiar click of carabiners, the solid feel of the rope in my hands. It felt real. The air outside was electric, charged with the smell of wet pine and churning water. The reservoir was high, lapping at the edges of its banks. The dam was a monstrous shadow against the churning sky, a low rumble vibrating through the ground. I made my way to the far end, away from the houses, my flashlight beam cutting a nervous path through the darkness. This was crazy. I knew it. A 55-year-old man in the middle of a storm, about to rappel down the face of a dam. If I slipped, if a piece of that old concrete gave way, that was it. No one would find me until morning. But the memory of my last big failure, the bridge, the collapsed steel, the career I'd lost by trusting someone else's work, pushed me forward. This time, I would see for myself. I anchored my rope to one of the old iron bollards at the top, tested it twice, then a third time. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I took a deep breath and swung myself out over the edge. The world dissolved into a terrifying rush of wind, water, and darkness. The face of the dam was slick with rain and algae. My feet scrabbled for purchase on the crumbling concrete. The noise was deafening. The roar of the wind, the cascade of water from the spillway. Every few feet, I stopped, bracing myself against the wall, and pulled out my father's old dynamometer. This was the moment of truth. An engineer's word is only as good as his measurements. According to the original plans I dug up in an online archive, this dam was held together by a series of deep-set steel anchor bolts, tying the concrete face to the bedrock behind it. They were the bones of the structure. I found the first inspection point, a small metal plate set flush with the concrete. I screwed the dynamometer's hook into it and pulled, applying a precise amount of torso. The needle on the gauge barely moved, solid, just like the plans said. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just a paranoid old man chasing shadows. I rappelled down another 20 feet, the spray from the spillway soaking me to the bone. I found the next inspection plate. I hooked up the dynamometer, braced myself, and pulled. This time, the needle shot across the gauge. The The hook pulled free with a sickening crunch of rusted metal and crumbling concrete. My blood ran cold. There was nothing there. The anchor bolt was either gone or had corroded to dust. The concrete was just a facade, a hollow shell. I swung sideways, my boots scraping against the wall, and found another point at the same level. I tested it. Same result. A little resistance, then nothing. I hung there in the roaring darkness, suspended 50 feet above the churning water, and I finally understood. I wasn't just right. I was more right than I could have possibly imagined. The dam wasn't just in disrepair. It was a catastrophe waiting to happen. The entire structure was a lie, held up by gravity and wishful thinking. Here's the thing about secrets. They have a weight, and Karen and Bob and whoever else was in on this, they had been carrying this one for years. My little Jetty wasn't the threat. The threat was me, an engineer, someone who might start asking the right questions, someone who might decide to go looking. Their entire campaign of harassment, the fake maps, the insurance hikes, it was all a desperate, panicked attempt to scare me away before I got too close to the truth. As I hung there, a single chilling phrase echoed in my mind, a quote I'd seen chiseled into the cornerstone of a library once. Some things don't burn. Well, some things don't hold forever. I had found her secret. But what do you do with a secret that could destroy an entire town? Revealing it would cause a panic. Hiding it was unthinkable. I had the truth in my hands, a truth I'd risk my life for. But the victory felt terrifyingly hollow. I had found the disease, but the cure could be worse. Climbing back up that dam was 10 times harder than going down. Every foot of rope I gained felt like hauling a mountain. It wasn't just my own weight, it was the weight of what I now knew. The concrete under my feet felt like crumbling sugar. By the time I hauled myself over the edge, gasping and shivering, the first hint of dawn was bruising the eastern sky. The rain had softened to a miserable drizzle. I stumbled home, my mind a whirlwind of numbers and catastrophic failure points. The data I'd collected with my father's dynamometer painted a horrifying picture. The dam's integrity was compromised by at least 40%. A serious storm, a minor seismic tremor, even just the relentless pressure of a high water season. It wouldn't take much. Karen wasn't just covering up a lie, she was sitting on a time bomb. I spent the next day in a fever of activity. I didn't trust anyone in town, not anymore. Not the board, not the local authorities who had clearly been asleep at the wheel for decades. I needed an outside expert, someone with unimpeachable credentials. I found him through an old college contact, a professor of acoustic diagnostics, a man who could listen to the heartbeat of concrete and tell you its secrets. It took another $2,000 from my dwindling savings, a retainer to get him to even look at my data. But when he saw my hand-drawn charts and the readings from the dynamometer, his voice on the phone went from skeptical to grave. "If these numbers are accurate, Mr. Chen," he said, "you're not looking at a maintenance issue. You're looking at an imminent threat." He agreed to come out, bringing his equipment. This was my new plan, a live, public test. A demonstration so clear, so undeniable, that not even Karen Miller's scariest stories could refute it. But Karen was always one step ahead. As I was on the phone finalizing the details with the professor, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on my door. I opened it to find 2 sheriff's deputies. A man and a woman, both with the same weary, no-nonsense expression. The man was holding a piece of paper. "Michael Chen?" he asked. "Yes." "You're under arrest." My world tilted on its axis. Arrest? For what? "Trespassing on municipal property, vandalism, and willful endangerment of public infrastructure," the woman recited, her voice flat and bored. "We have a signed complaint from the Homeowners Association, and a witness who saw you on the dam last night." Bob? It had to be Bob. He must have seen my light or heard me and made the call. The betrayal was so sharp, so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. They'd turned my own ally, my own colleague, into their weapon. They put me in the back of the patrol car. The smell of stale air freshener and disinfectant filled my lungs. As we pulled away, I saw her, Karen. She was standing on her porch, holding a mug of coffee, watching me be taken away. She wasn't smiling. She just had a look of calm, righteous victory. This was her endgame. Discredit me, isolate me, and if that didn't work, have me thrown in jail. I spent 8 hours in a holding cell at the county sheriff's office. 8 hours of fluorescent lights humming, the toilet in the corner smelling faintly of bleach, and the crushing weight of failure pressing down on me. My one phone call went to a bail bondsman. They let me out just after dark, my wallet $5,000 lighter. My reputation was in tatters, I was facing criminal charges, and I was almost broke. This is the point, isn't it? The moment where you're supposed to give up. The point where the fight is just too costly, the enemy too powerful. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to pack my bags, sell the house at a loss, and just disappear. Let the dam break. Let the town wash away. They had made their choice. They had chosen to believe the comforting lie over the terrifying truth. Why should I keep fighting for people who had already branded me a criminal? I drove home in a daze. My house felt cold, empty, an enemy outpost. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the pile of bills, the threatening letters from the homeowners association, the notice of my upcoming court date. I was beaten. Have you ever been there, at the absolute bottom, where there's no fight left in you, where you look at the mountain in front of you and finally admit you can't climb it? My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me look. It was just 3 words. Don't give up. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Who was this? An ally I didn't know I had? A trick? Then another text came through. A photo. It was a grainy, zoomed-in picture of the annual community notice board. Pinned to the corkboard was a flyer. Annual Flood Preparedness and Safety Inspection, it read. This Saturday, at the dam. All residents encouraged to attend. It was a setup. It was Karen's victory lap, a public event where she would be lauded as the town's protector, standing in front of the very structure she knew was about to fail. It was meant to be the final nail in my coffin. But as I looked at that flyer, a new wild idea began to form in my mind, a desperate, insane, beautiful idea. She was giving me a stage, and I was going to give them the show of a lifetime. The text message was a spark in the dark. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Someone was watching. Someone believed me. I never found out who sent it. Maybe it was the young technician with the gay radar. Maybe it was a board member with a guilty conscience. In the end, it didn't matter. It was the push I needed. Karen's safety inspection was in 3 days. I had to move fast. My grand plan for a full acoustic diagnostic was out. I couldn't afford the professor anymore, and bringing a stranger into this mess was too risky. I had to use what I had, my own skills, my father's old tools, and the element of surprise. The charges against me were a problem, but my lawyer, a young, overworked public defender, had managed to get the hearing postponed. It bought me time. First, I called David. He was the acoustic diagnostics professor's top graduate student, a kid in his mid-20s with more brains than sense and a deep-seated hatred for corporate cover-ups. I'd spoken to him briefly when I first contacted his professor. I couldn't offer him money, but I could offer him something better, a real-world test case that was about to blow up. I can't pay you, I told him over the phone, the words tasting like ash. And it's legally complicated. But I have a dam that's about to fail, and a politician who's going to stand in front of it and lie to 100 people. I need to prove she's wrong, live in front of everyone. There was a long pause. I could hear the kid breathing on the other end of the line. When and where? He finally asked, my first ally. Next, I turned my attention back to the dam itself. My nighttime inspection was crude. I needed a simpler, more visual way to demonstrate the problem. The answer came to me as I was staring at the cracks in my own driveway, water and dye. The plan was simple, and that was its beauty. The acoustic test would be the science, the part that looked official, but the dye would be the theater. The night before the safety inspection, David arrived in a beat-up pickup truck, his gear rattling in the back. He looked even younger in person, a skinny kid with intense eyes and a nervous energy. He was perfect. We didn't have time to be subtle. Under the cover of darkness, we went back to the dam. This time, I wasn't there to measure. I was there to prepare the stage. While David scouted locations for his acoustic sensors, I went to work on the face of the dam. The emergency spillway Karen had invented, the old, empty channel, was my target. At the top of the channel, just out of sight from the public viewing area, was an old maintenance drain covered by a rusted grate. Using a crowbar, I pried it open. The air that wafted out smelled of decay and stagnant water. I poured 5 gallons of highly concentrated, non-toxic fluorescent green dye down that drain. the kind they use to trace leaks in plumbing systems. It vanished into the darkness with a hungry gurgle. If Karen's story was true, the dye would simply sit in the empty channel. But if I was right, and the dam was riddled with internal cracks and fissures, that dye was going to find its way through the concrete. We worked until the early hours of the morning, the air cold and sharp. By the time we were done, David had his sensors hidden in plain sight on the dam's face, connected by thin, almost invisible wires to a laptop he would operate from the crowd. My dye was in place. The trap was set. I got home as the sun was rising, my body aching, my hands raw. I hadn't slept in 2 days. As I washed the grime from my face, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked old, tired. But the fear that had been living in my gut for weeks was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. What would you do if you had to bet everything you had left on one last, desperate play? Your home, your freedom, your name? Would you fold? Or would you push all your chips to the center of the table? If you're still with me on this one, stick around. You might want to subscribe, because what happened next is something you won't forget. That Saturday was a perfect spring day. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue, the kind of day that makes people believe everything is going to be all right. The whole town, it seemed, had turned out for Karen's event. Families with strollers, retirees in lawn chairs, local news reporters with cameras. A perfect audience. Karen was in her element, standing at a podium set up in front of the dam, looking poised and authoritative. She spoke of community, of safety, of vigilance. She pointed to the dam behind her as a symbol of their strength and stability. I stood at the back of the crowd, next to David, who was trying to look casual with his laptop bag. My heart was a drum against my ribs. It was time. I took a deep breath and started walking forward, right through the middle of the crowd. People turned to stare. The whispers started immediately. What's he doing here? I thought he was arrested. The nerve of that guy. I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of the podium. Karen's speech faltered. Her eyes narrowed into slits of pure hatred. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice dangerously low, into the microphone. "You are not welcome here. You are trespassing." I looked out at the crowd, at the sea of hostile faces. Then I looked back at her. "You're right, Karen," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be here." I pointed a finger at the massive concrete wall behind her. "Because that dam isn't safe." A gasp went through the crowd. Karen's face went white with rage. "Security!" she hissed into the microphone. "Remove this man immediately!" 2 of her private security guards started moving toward me, but I held up my hand. "Just one question, Karen," I projected, my voice booming across the stunned silence. "You talk about safety. You talk about infrastructure. Then you should have no problem with a live, independent test. Right here, right now." Before she could answer, David, my young ace in the hole, stepped forward. "My name is David Chen," he said, pulling his laptop from his bag. "I'm a graduate researcher in structural diagnostics. With your permission, I'd like to conduct a simple acoustic stress test." The crowd murmured. The press cameras swiveled toward us. Karen was trapped. To refuse a public safety test at her own safety event would be an admission of guilt. Her jaw clenched. "Fine," she spat. "Get on with your little show. Prove to everyone what a fool you are." That was all the invitation we needed. David powered up his laptop, and a large monitor I'd instructed him to bring flickered to life, showing a simple line graph. "These sensors on the dam measure resonant frequency," David explained to the baffled crowd. "A solid, stable structure has a low, consistent frequency. Think of it like a bass drum. A structure with internal cracks and voids vibrates at a higher, erratic frequency, like a broken guitar string." He nodded to me. This was my cue. I walked over to the base of the dam, pulling a small, rubber-headed mallet from my coat pocket. It looked ridiculous, like a toy. I took a deep breath and swung it against a section of concrete far from the area I'd inspected. Thump. A deep, solid sound echoed. On the monitor, the line barely quivered. "That," I said, turning to the crowd, "is the sound of healthy concrete, the sound of safety." Then I walked 20 yards down the wall to the exact spot where my dynamometer had met nothing but rust and air. The crowd was silent, their eyes flicking from me to the monitor. I raised the mallet again. This time, the sound was completely different. A hollow, sickening thwack. A dead sound. On the monitor, the line exploded. It jagged upwards in a frantic, chaotic spike. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. They didn't need to be engineers to understand what they were seeing. They were looking at a picture of a structure that was screaming in agony. "That," I said, my voice shaking with adrenaline, "is the sound of a lie." But I wasn't done. The acoustic test was the science. Now came the theater. "And one more thing," I called out, pointing to the top of the dam at the spot where I'd poured the dye. "Karen told you about an emergency spillway channel. Let's see it in action." I pulled a small remote from my pocket. The night before, I'd rigged a simple battery-powered pump to a hose I'd fed into a nearby stream. I pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, high up on the face of the dam, water began to trickle from the old maintenance drain I'd opened. At first, it was just a dark trickle. Then, as it mixed with the dye I'd poured, it began to change. A thin, sickly green line appeared, snaking its way down the gray concrete. It wasn't staying in a channel, it was weeping, bleeding. The green dye was seeping out of a dozen invisible cracks and fissures, spreading across the face of the dam like a disease. It was a ghastly, undeniable visualization of the dam's internal decay. The show was over. The silence was absolute. No one was looking at me anymore. They were all staring, horrified, at the weeping green stains on their dam. They were staring at the jagged, panicked line on the monitor. They were staring at the truth. I turned to Karen. The color had drained from her face. She looked small and frail behind the podium. Her eyes met mine, and in them I saw not hatred, but total soul-crushing defeat. She knew it was all over. Her kingdom of lies had crumbled into dust. In the end, there was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, just the quiet hum of the news cameras and the horrified whispers of the crowd. The regional insurance boss, who I had made sure was invited, was already on his phone, his face grim. Bob, my old friend, stood at the edge of the crowd, tears streaming down his face. He wasn't crying for Karen. He was crying for the years he'd spent living with this secret. They evacuated 300 homes that afternoon. The dam was declared a state of emergency. Karen Miller was stripped of her insurance license and faced a mountain of lawsuits and federal fraud charges. The Homeowners Association was dissolved. My own charges? They were dropped so fast they probably broke the sound barrier. I got what I wanted. I got to build my jetty. I sit out on it sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, and look at the new reinforced wall of the dam glinting in the sunset. They offered me a lucrative contract to oversee the repairs, a chance to get my old career back. I turned it down. Instead, I volunteered to lead the new Community Oversight Committee, for free. My victory wasn't about money or revenge. It was about doing the job right, about sleeping at night. But there's a price for telling the truth. I saved their homes, but I also destroyed their peace of mind. I'm not the pariah anymore, but I'm not exactly a friend either. I'm the man who showed them the monster under their bed. They're grateful, but they keep their distance. The other day I received a small anonymous package in the mail. Inside, there was no note, just an old tarnished brass plaque. It was the original dedication plate from the dam, dated 1938. On the back, someone had scratched a message with a nail. "Thank you." I keep it on my workbench, next to my father's old dynamometer. It's a reminder that some fights you don't choose. They choose you, and that sometimes the only way to fix something that's broken is to first prove just how broken it is. What do you think? Was it worth it? Let me know in the comments below. It's a question I ask myself every time I look out at that water.